The night Sloane Whitfield got the call that changed everything, she was standing in her kitchen in Oakville, still in her work blazer, reheating leftover pasta because her husband had forgotten, again, that they'd planned to have dinner together. She didn't even check the caller ID at first. She assumed it was her assistant, or maybe her brother calling to complain about something small, but the voice on the other end was Leonard Graves, her lawyer, and the first thing he said was, "It's done. The transfer cleared this afternoon, the whole thing is yours." Sloane set the fork down. She looked at the pasta, the steam rising from it, the way it all looked so ordinary. "All of it?" she asked. "Every share," Leonard said. "Nexbridge Capital is yours." She said thank you. She said she'd call him in the morning. She hung up, and she stood there for a long moment, and then she picked up her fork and finished her dinner alone. Across the house she could hear her husband Carter laughing at something on his phone. That low private laugh he used when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She'd been hearing that laugh a lot lately. She'd met Carter Whitfield 11 years ago at a conference in Montreal. He was charming in that particular way that men who've never had to work very hard for anything tend to be: easy with compliments, comfortable in rooms full of important people, never quite still. Sloane had been 29, newly promoted to senior analyst at her firm, and she'd been flattered that someone like Carter even noticed her. Her mother had called him a catch. Her colleagues had called him lucky to have her, though they usually said it quietly, the way people say things they mean but aren't sure are polite. They married 2 years later. A small ceremony in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Sloane wore a dress she'd found at a boutique in Kensington Market, ivory silk that she'd had altered twice. Carter's mother had cried at the reception and told Sloane she was exactly what the family needed. Sloane hadn't known quite what that meant at the time. She knew later. What it meant was that Carter had been engaged before briefly to a woman his family didn't approve of. What it meant was that Sloane, steady, professional, understated Sloane, was the kind of wife who would make Carter look responsible, grounded, serious. And for a while it worked both ways. Carter was social in ways Sloane wasn't. He opened rooms for her, introduced her to people, made evenings feel effortless. She was good at the parts he found boring: the follow-through, the strategy, the long game. The company had been Carter's idea technically. Nexbridge Capital, a private investment firm, mid-sized, focused on real estate development and infrastructure. Carter had the family name, a few early investors, and the confidence to pitch it. But the actual architecture of the thing, the fund structures, the risk models, the relationships with the institutional lenders, that had been Sloane. She'd kept her own name off most of it, at Carter's suggestion. "It's cleaner," he'd said. "Less complicated." She'd agreed because she was busy, because she trusted him, because it hadn't seemed to matter. That was the first mistake, not trusting him. Trusting him so completely that she'd stopped paying attention. The second mistake was taking the leave. It hadn't been her choice exactly. Her father had gotten sick. A slow, grinding illness that required someone to be present, to manage his care, to sit in rooms with doctors and translate what they said into something her mother could hold on to. Sloane was the eldest. It fell to her. She'd taken an extended leave from Nexbridge, handed her day-to-day responsibilities to Carter, and spent 14 months commuting between Oakville and her parents' house in Guelph. During that time, Carter hired Tanya. He'd described her as an operations manager. Sloane had met her once, briefly, at the office. A woman in her early 30s with that particular kind of poise that comes from knowing exactly what effect you have on people. Sloane had shaken her hand and thought nothing of it. She'd been too tired to think much of anything that year. Her father passed away in February. Sloane came back to the office in March. By April she understood, not because anyone told her, because she knew how to read a room, and she knew how to read Carter, and she knew the particular quality of his distraction when she walked in, and he quickly put his phone face down on the desk. She knew it in the way he started having evening meetings that ran long. She knew it in the way Tanya had been moved from operations into a newly created strategic development role that reported directly to Carter, which had never been discussed with Sloane. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She was very good at the long game. What Carter didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that during the 14 months Sloane had spent looking after her father, she hadn't stopped working entirely. She'd just stopped working for Nexbridge. Her father, before he got sick, had introduced her to a woman named Ruth Alderman. Ruth was 72 years old, had started and sold 3 companies, and had more money than she had any use for. She and Sloane had started talking during one of the many long afternoons at the care facility, and somewhere in those conversations Ruth had made her an offer. Not a formal one, not at first. More of an invitation, to think differently about what's actually wanted. "You're running someone else's business," Ruth had said once, very plainly. "You've been doing it for years, you know that, right?" Sloane had laughed, then she'd thought about it for 3 days. Ruth became her first investor, quietly. through a numbered company with no obvious connection to Sloan. They called the holding entity Aldervale Group. Bland enough to be forgettable, solid enough to be taken seriously. Over 14 months, while Carter was busy with Nexbridge and Tanya, Sloan had been building something that had no nameplate on the door yet, but had real weight. By the time Sloan came back from Guelph, Aldervale had quietly acquired enough shares in Nexbridge, through secondary purchases, through a small group of discreet sellers, to constitute a controlling interest. Carter had no idea. The sellers had been institutional investors who'd been growing cautious about Nexbridge's direction under Carter's sole management. Sloan knew who they were. She'd built those relationships herself years ago, when she was still the one in the room who knew what she was doing. Leonard Graves had called at 7:43 on a Thursday evening, and Carter was in the other room, laughing at his phone. She gave it 3 weeks. She went to work, she sat in meetings, she watched Carter perform authority in a room full of people who'd mostly been hired after she left. She watched Tanya move through the office like she owned the floor plan. She filed it all away. She also started making quiet changes, small ones. Aldervale appointed a new board observer, a retired CFO named Hugh Beaumont, who had a reputation for being meticulous and said almost nothing at the first meeting, which made everyone in the room nervous in exactly the way Sloan intended. She requested a full audit review, which was well within the rights of a controlling shareholder. The audit came back with several items that required clarification. Carter was asked formally to respond. He came home that evening looking rattled in a way Sloan hadn't seen before. He poured himself a drink before he'd even put his coat down. She watched him from across the kitchen. "Rough day?" she asked. "Bored stuff," he said. "Nothing?" "Okay," she said and turned back to the stove. She'd made dinner herself that night. Roast chicken, the way his mother used to make it, because Sloan had once taken the time to learn and Carter had never noticed. The conversation she'd been waiting for came 10 days later. He brought it up on a Sunday morning, which surprised her. She'd expected him to wait until he had some kind of angle, some prepared position. But he sat down across from her at the kitchen table while she was reading the paper, an actual paper, the Globe, which she still preferred to anything on a screen, and he said, "I think we need to talk." She put the paper down. "Okay, this isn't working." He said it carefully, like he'd rehearsed it. "I think we both know that, and I think it would be better for both of us if we were honest about it." She waited. "I've been unhappy for a while," he said. "I don't think you've been happy either. And I think there's someone else who makes more sense for where I am now, in my life." There it was, Tanya, Sloan said. Not a question. He at least had the grace not to pretend otherwise. He nodded once. "How long, Sloan? How long, Carter?" He looked at the table. "About a year and a half." She did the math quickly without showing it on her face. Before her father died, before she'd come back, while she'd been sitting in hospital waiting rooms. She nodded slowly. "And you'd like a divorce?" "I think it's the right thing. For both of us." She looked at him for a moment. This man she'd spent 11 years building a life alongside. This man whose business she'd constructed from a pitch deck and a family name. And she thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the audit. She thought about Hugh Beaumont's expression when he'd read the third quarter reports. She thought about Ruth Alderman laughing over bad coffee in a hospital hallway, saying, "You're running someone else's business. You know that, right?" "I'll have Leonard reach out to your lawyer," Sloan said. She picked up the paper. "He'll be in touch this week." Carter blinked. He'd clearly expected more. He'd expected tears maybe, or anger, or the kind of messy scene he could use later to justify himself. He got none of it. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. "Do you want coffee?" The divorce was quiet, legally speaking. Sloan had excellent counsel and she'd already spent months ensuring that her personal assets, the things she'd built through Aldervale, were cleanly separated from anything joint. Carter's lawyer came to the table expecting a fight over Nexbridge, and found that the ownership question had already been largely settled in a direction no one on Carter's side had anticipated. Sloan's name had never been on the Nexbridge letterhead, but Aldervale Group was the controlling shareholder of record, and Aldervale was hers. Carter's lawyer asked for a meeting. Carter called her himself that same evening, which was unusual. He never called when he could text, and he never texted when he could avoid it. "What is this?" he said. The ease was gone from his voice. "What is Aldervale?" "A holding company," Sloan said, pleasantly. Sloan, his voice was different now. Tighter. "What did you do?" "I protected my interests," she said, "which I should have been doing for years." There was a long pause. She could hear him breathing. She thought about the kitchen table that Sunday morning. "I think there's someone else who makes more sense for where I am now." She thought about Tanya, moving through the office like she owned the floor plan. "The shares," he started, "were acquired legally, from willing sellers, over a period of more than a year," she said. "Leonard can send you the documentation if you'd like. You've been planning this. "I've been protecting myself," she said. "There's a difference." She could hear the moment it landed, the full weight of it settling over him. The timeline, the audit, Hugh Beaumont's careful silence in the boardroom. The fact that his ex-wife, whose name had never been on the letterhead, was now his company's majority shareholder. "This isn't over," he said. "Carter," she said quietly, "I know you think that, but I think if you talk to your lawyer tomorrow, really talk to him, you'll find that it probably is." She said goodnight. She hung up. The board meeting was 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Sloane walked into the Nextbridge boardroom at 9 in the morning in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers, her hair down, which she almost never wore down in professional settings, but she'd decided it felt right today. Hugh Beaumont was already seated. 2 of the independent directors nodded at her. She'd met with them individually over the past month, quiet conversations over coffee in the kind of downtown Toronto hotels where you can have a private discussion without running into people you know. Carter was there. Of course he was. He still held a minority stake, and he was still technically listed as a director, though that was a matter that the new board was going to address before lunch. He looked up when she walked in, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't quite prepared herself for, not anger, which she'd expected, but something closer to bewilderment, like a man who had run a very confident con and only now, standing in front of the mark, understood that the con had been running the other way the entire time. Tanya was not in the meeting. She'd tendered her resignation the previous week. Sloane had accepted it through Leonard's office without any particular comment. Sloane took her seat at the head of the table. She thanked everyone for being there. She said she knew there had been uncertainty over the past several months, and she appreciated their patience. She said Nextbridge was a strong company with solid fundamentals, and that she had every intention of building on that. She did not look at Carter when she said it. She didn't have to. One of the directors, a woman named Susan who Sloane had always liked, asked about the strategic direction going forward. Sloane talked for about 20 minutes. She knew these numbers the way other people know their own faces, reflexively without effort, because she'd built them from scratch. She watched the room as she talked. She watched people's expressions change. At the end of the meeting, after the formal resolutions were passed and the new board structure was agreed upon, Carter stood up. She thought he was going to say something. For a moment she wasn't sure what it would be. He gathered his things. He didn't speak. He walked to the door. He stopped once, with his hand on the doorframe. He didn't turn around. "You always were better at this than me," he said, and then he left. She took the long way home that evening, through the lakeshore, the way she used to drive when she needed to think. The water was gray and very still. It was mid-October and the light was going early. She stopped at a spot she used to stop at years ago, before the company, before Carter, before most of it, a small park with a bench that faced the water and nobody usually around this time of year. She sat for a while. The wind off the lake was cold. She thought about her father. She thought about what he used to say when she was a teenager and felt like things weren't going her way. "Just keep going. You don't have to be loud about it. Just keep going." She thought about Ruth Alderman, who'd been texting her emoji since the board meeting. Inexplicable emoji, the cactus, the chess piece, the Canadian flag, in a pattern that Sloane suspected meant Ruth was very pleased with herself. She thought about the 11 years. Not with bitterness exactly. More like the feeling of setting down something heavy that you've carried so long, you stopped noticing how much it weighed. A woman walked by with a dog, a yellow lab who lurched toward the water and was redirected. The woman caught Sloane's eye and smiled the way strangers smile when they happen to be in the same quiet place at the same time. Sloane smiled back. Then she took out her phone. She had 14 unread messages. Her assistant, 2 board members, her brother, 3 messages, probably all variations on the same question, Leonard and Ruth, who had sent the maple leaf emoji 3 times in a row. She started with Ruth. "It went well," she typed. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "Of course it did," Ruth wrote back. "I told you, now stop working and go eat something." Sloane laughed alone on the bench in the cold with the lake going dark in front of her. She stayed a little longer, just long enough. Then she got back in the car and drove home. Her house, her name on the deed, her life, finally arranged the way she'd always known it could be, and she didn't look back.